Valletta, Malta, 15th of August, 1942. Crowds packed Grand Harbor as a broken tanker, held upright by destroyers, crept toward the quay. Its decks sagged, its pumps groaned, and fires still smoldered. Inside sloshed the fuel that kept Malta's fighters airborne and its bakeries lit. Lose it, and the island's defense and daily bread fell silent. By mid-1942, Malta starved under siege. Convoys had been mauled for months. Airfields ran dry while Axis bombers ranged freely. Operation Pedestal, a Royal Navy convoy sent in August to break the blockade, set the stage for a single, all-or-nothing delivery. This is how convoys, ration coupons, government tickets limiting how much a person could buy, and logistic calculus, the math of supply, risk, and routes, converged on one day to keep an island alive and shift the Mediterranean balance. In Valletta in the summer of 1942, lines formed before dawn. People clutched ration coupons, government-printed tickets required to buy scarce goods. The math was brutal. 270,000 civilians on an island that could grow little, with supplies falling by the day. The question was simple and unforgiving. How much had to arrive? How fast to keep Malta alive and useful? Malta sat south of Sicily between Italy and North Africa. That location was not picturesque. It was decisive. Axis cargo ships to Libya and, later, Tunisia passed within striking range. From this compact outpost, British submarines and bombers hunted them. When Malta spoke, Axis supply lines bled. When it fell quiet, those lines flowed. By mid-1942, the island ran on coupons and strict routine. Flour stocks measured in weeks, aviation fuel in days. Kerosene kept kitchens going where electricity failed, and it also ran vehicles and pumps. Without kerosene and flour, ovens went cold. Without aviation fuel, fighters could not climb to meet raids. Food, fuel, and air defense formed a triangle. Break one side and the rest collapsed. Grand Harbor was Malta's intake valve, a deep-water port at Valletta that took the hammer blows. Its quays were cratered. Cranes were bent or burned. The Regia Aeronautica, Royal Italian Air Force, and the Luftwaffe, German Air Force, pounded docks, storehouses, and airfields in an effort to shut the valve. They aimed to make not just arrivals impossible, but unloading and distribution as well. A ship that reached the breakwater still had to get cargo ashore, under fire, and onto lorries before another raid. Siege meant more than bombing. Nights went black to hide the streets. Bakeries worked with damaged ovens and interrupted power. Hospitals stretched staff and supplies through raid after raid, treating blast wounds and burns while struggling to keep lights on and clean water flowing. Ration queues moved by coupon and chalk marks, not by cash. The governing logic was scarcity managed by paper. The stakes ran beyond hunger. Malta's airfields were launch pads for Beaufighters and Wellingtons that struck at Axis convoys. Its submarine pens sheltered boats that waited in the Narrows. If Malta's fighters lacked fuel, the island itself was exposed. If they had fuel, they also protected the naval approach that kept the island fed. Strategy and survival intertwined. The island was both a base and a mouth. Planners reduced this complexity to ledgers and minimums. They mapped priority in a crisis. Fuel to air defense first, then to strike units, then to civil power and transport. They quantified flour, sugar, oil, and coal by daily burn rate. The results were stark. Small deliveries would not alter the curve. They would only delay the fail point by days. The island needed a surge large enough to restart air combat at scale and to refill the larders, not a trickle that kept the lights dim and the runways quiet. Why not airlift? A heavy bomber hauled a few tons on a good day. Malta needed thousands of tons each week. Submarines could slip through, but their cargo capacity was measured in tens of tons, not thousands. Fast warships could carry drums, but those were battlefield bandages, not a transfusion. Only a massed convoy could bring enough tonnage fast enough to match her. Only a massed convoy could fight its way in, unload under pressure, and reset the island's food and fuel ledger. By late spring, talk narrowed from options to risks. The convoy would be a moving target through waters covered by enemy bases that were close and numerous. Torpedo bombers trained to attack shipping. Mines could be laid overnight in the approaches. The airfields on Malta needed fuel to provide cover during the endgame, which meant the convoy had to arrive before those tanks ran dry. The plan accepted casualties up front because delay was a different kind of defeat. For civilians, the siege war grooves into daily life. Bread rations shrank in weight and variety, and fresh meat became rare. People learned the sound of different aircraft and the pattern of sirens. Water cisterns mattered. So did a neighbor with a working stove. Queues tied to coupons imposed order, but also told a story each morning. Survival depended on ships that had not yet appeared on the horizon. Operation Pedestal took shape inside this hard frame. The name masked the reality. A heavily escorted convoy with a very short window and a timed arrival. It was framed, from London to Valletta, as a do-or-die run because the arithmetic left little else. If it succeeded, Malta could speak loudly again in the Mediterranean. If it failed, the island would still stand, but only as a quiet rock. The coming fight was about bread and fuel, but also about whether Axis logistics to North Africa would move unpunished in the months ahead. At Gibraltar in August 1942, 14 merchant ships drew together behind a moving wall of steel. If they reached Malta, an island ate and fought. If they failed, engines and ovens went quiet. The plan put one ship at the center of that bet and built a fleet around it. That ship was SS Ohio, a fast American-built tanker, a ship designed to carry liquid cargo such as fuel. Inside her tanks lay about 13,000 tons of fuel, including aviation spirit avgas, high-octane gasoline for aircraft. Avgas was volatile and precious. It fed the fighters that kept Malta's skies contested. Ohio had the speed and pumping gear to matter the day she arrived, not a week later. The escort was one of the heaviest seen in the Mediterranean. More than 40 warships sailed. 2 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, Eagle, Indomitable, Victorious, Furious, 7 cruisers and 32 destroyers. Their task was blunt. Keep speed, keep formation, and keep attackers outside the killing range. The crossing to Malta was roughly 1,000 nautical miles, about the distance from London to Rome. A knot, 1 nautical mile per hour, translated convoy orders into time. At 13 knots, the planned pace, the run took a little over 3 days, longer if damage or weather forced reductions. That speed was not bravado. It shortened exposure and complicated torpedo timing. Convoy doctrine turned numbers into survival. Ships held tight stations so anti-aircraft arcs overlapped and left no empty lane. Destroyers rotated in the screen, the outer ring of escorts, to keep fresh eyes and guns forward, and rotated again to tow any damaged merchantman clear. The column zigzagged, pre-planned course changes to spoil torpedo aim, but never so wildly that the formation shattered. The plan broke into phases. Carriers would throw a canopy of fighters over the convoy as long as sea room allowed. Heavy ships would shield the formation until it reached the Sicilian Narrows, the constricted waters between Tunisia and Sicily, where torpedoes, mines, and fast attack craft crowded the map. There the cover force would turn back rather than fight in a trap. Furious was a ferry carrier, a carrier used to deliver aircraft with a single job: sprint forward, launch Spitfires, a British single-seat fighter, to reinforce Malta's air defense, then leave the danger zone. That detail mattered. Fuel without fighters was less useful, and fighters without fuel were brief guests. The plan tried to synchronize both: new aircraft overhead, then the tanker that fed them. Beyond the turnback line, the burden fell on Force X, the close escort of cruisers and destroyers. They would push through toward Malta, fight in coastal range, and if needed take ships in tow under fire. The cruiser captains understood the arithmetic. Speed kept options, stopping bunched targets and made them easy. The Axis prepared the counters. The Regia Marina, Royal Italian Navy, had surface units and motor torpedo boats in the Narrows and laid mines in the approaches. U-boats, German submarines, waited along the route, cued by reconnaissance and practiced in night attacks. From airfields on Sicily and Sardinia, torpedo bombers trained to hit ships on the turn and the climb. Logistic calculus set priorities inside that gauntlet. Flour and ammunition mattered, but fuel had leverage. With fuel, Malta's fighters rose, and the rest of the convoy had better odds in the last miles. Without it, the island would accept food under a sky it could not contest. Planners made a hard call. If choices came, save Ohio over Hull count. That choice shaped dispositions. Ohio steamed near the center, bracketed by ships with the heaviest anti-aircraft batteries and destroyers drilled for instant rescue or tow. Pumps, hoses, and spare gear were prepositioned so that if she limped in, unloading could start with minutes, not hours. The convoy existed not as 13 equal merchantmen, but as one indispensable cargo and 13 supporting actors. Signal flags broke out. Sirens wailed the last harbor orders. The formation slid east into the Strait of Gibraltar, and then into open water, where the math of distance and speed met the practiced violence of submariners and pilots. Ahead lay the Narrows, and the test of whether a single tanker could be carried through by design and by sacrifice. On the 11th of August, 1942, a white flash ran along HMS Eagle's port side. The carrier rolled, listed, and went down in 8 minutes. Air cover thinned at once, and the convoy's shield grew holes that widened with every mile east. U-73 had fired 4 torpedoes and found its mark. More than 100 men died. Hundreds more were pulled aboard escorts slick with oil. The lesson was immediate. Without Eagle's fighters flying constant circles overhead, attackers could choose their moment and angle. By midday on the 12th of August, the sky filled in layers. Stukas, Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers fell out of the sun in steep dives. SM-79, Italian torpedo bombers, came in low and fast, their crews trained to drop on the turn. The convoy bristled with guns, a moving hedgehog of tracers and shrapnel bursts, but gunnery could not be perfect everywhere at once. The methods differed, the goal did not. Bombs aimed to wreck flight decks and smash steering. Torpedoes sought the thin-skinned spaces between armor and keel. Each pass cost ammunition and nerve. Each near-miss loosened rivets and sprung plates even when no hole showed. Then another blow. In the afternoon, bombs struck HMS Indomitable. Fires scorched her flight deck, elevators jammed. She limped west under escort, her fighters withdrawn with her. Furious had already turned back after flying off Spitfires to Malta. That left Victorious to stretch her few fighters across a sky crowded with threats and geography narrowing ahead. The convoy pressed toward the Sicilian Narrows, where land closed in and margins closed with it. Radar screens flickered. Spray and smoke confused returns. As dusk bled into night on the 12th, new attackers appeared. MAS boat, Italian motor torpedo boat, packs slashed into the screen, low and hard to see, their wakes thin lines that showed too late. Near Kelibia on the Tunisian coast, the night turned bright with star shell and flares. A torpedo hit the cruiser Manchester. Flooding and power loss spread. Control vanished. Her captain chose scuttling rather than leave her as a blazing target and blocked channel. When she went down, a chunk of anti-aircraft firepower and command went with her. Submarines found their chances too. The anti-aircraft cruiser Cairo took a torpedo and could not be saved. Nigeria was hit and forced from the fight. Kenya was damaged but stayed on, slower and leaking. Each loss thinned the umbrella and stretched the escorts that remained. Formation discipline frayed. Merchantmen that straggled for repairs or to dodge wrecks drifted toward the edges where attackers waited. The 13th of August opened with a burst of daylight violence. Bombs found Waimarama, a tanker loaded with aviation spirit. She detonated in a towering fireball. Fragments rained across the sea and crewmen vanished into boiling water. Deucalion went under. Glenorchy followed. Others burned or scattered under smoke screens and parachute flares that turned the morning a dirty gray. Survivors clung to Carly floats, circular life rafts used by the Royal Navy, their faces black with oil. Destroyers fished them out when they could, then accelerated back into the ring. Every rescue slowed an escort that also carried the guns that kept the next wave at bay. The convoy bled people in hulls and still pointed at Malta because turning back meant slow death and wasted sacrifice. Ohio drew fire like a magnet. Torpedoes found her. Bombs struck near enough to bend frames and burst seams. A stricken aircraft slammed into her deck, cracked steel and sprayed fuel where flames already licked. Steering failed, then engines. Her back sagged so badly that men spoke of her splitting. Pumps kept working. The fuel inside sloshed and stayed, volatile and essential. Towing began under fire because it had to. Destroyers edged alongside to pass hawsers and heave lines while shells fell short and stepped closer. A near miss lifted Ohio's stern clear of the water and snapped a tow like string. Another blast tore bollards out of deck plates. Crews re-rigged, built bridles, and tried again. They lashed escorts to her flanks to act as makeshift rudders and auxiliary engines. The calculus did not change as the roster shrank. Save Ohio, or else accept that Malta's fighters would stand silent and its ovens go cold. Ammunition ran low. Gun barrels glowed. Men worked until they shook from effort and shock, then worked more. The convoy had become a cluster around one crippled hull, moving by inches whenever the sea and enemy allowed. By the night of the 13th, the route ahead was shorter, but the gauntlet tightened. MAS boats returned. Submarines lurked. Flares hung. Each mile cost steel and sometimes lives plucked out of the black water with no name attached. Yet every time Ohio's pumps thumped and a tow line held, the promise of usefulness on arrival flickered back to life. By dawn on the 14th of August, the convoy was mauled. Warships and merchants lay behind on the bottom or limped away. But the fuel still floated in Ohio's torn tanks, and the battered cluster around her still moved toward Malta. The endgame would play out under coastal guns and within sight of the island that needed it. At first light, Ohio lay stopped, her propellers idle and her rudder useless. Escorts circled while crews tried one more tow, because every lost hour cut Malta's remaining flying time. The plan narrowed to a simple aim: keep the fuel inside her tanks moving toward Grand Harbor. Damage triage left little doubt. Steering was shattered, compartments aft and amidships flooded, frames bent so far that officers spoke of a broken back. Bulkheads, a ship's internal walls dividing compartments, held for now, flexing with each near miss. Aviation spirit leaked and flashed, went out, then pooled again as the hull worked. Captain Dudley Mason ordered abandoned ship more than once, then reversed it as volunteers reboarded to run pumps and patch lines. Destroyers took turns to tow. A hawser, a thick towing cable, came taut, bit deep into fair leads, and then snapped when a bomb's shock lifted Ohio's stern clear. Another line went on. Bollards tore out with a clang and a shower of rivets. Each failure cost time and hard-to-replace gear, but none changed the arithmetic of distance left to run. The solution was not a faster tow. It was a different geometry. HMS Penn and HMS Bramham came alongside and stayed there, lashed tight with wires and chain stoppers, fenders and timber shoring jammed between steel skins. Their engines became Ohio's engines. Their helms became her rudder. HMS Ledbury ranged ahead and abeam to fend off attackers and to pull when water opened, while the minesweeper HMS Rye felt for mines and kept the trio inside the cleared track. Attacks did not stop because the cables held. Near misses opened seams like zippers. Fresh cracks let avgas slosh across the decks until it bled through scuppers. Portable pumps rattled and choked on fuel-water mix. When they failed, bucket chains, lines of men passing pails by hand, took over, throwing liquid overboard or into scuppers while others spread foam and sand. Guns on the escorts beat a constant tattoo. Fire discipline stayed tight because ammunition was down to counted belts and clips. As the lash-up clawed east, Malta's patrols thickened overhead. The coast showed as a low line. Smoke of past raids hung over the island like a lid. On the 15th of August, the Feast of the Assumption, a Catholic holy day celebrating Mary's ascent, church bells and air raid sirens sounded together as the battered convoy reached the approaches. That mix of sacred and signal told the island that help was within sight, and that danger had not lifted. The entrance was a slow-motion problem in tide, draft, and wreckage. The trio scraped forward at walking speed, making perhaps 2 or 3 knots while lines creaked and steel plates ground. Crowds filled the bastions above Grand Harbor and fell silent as the odd raft of ships edged in, decks black with oil, men small against dented hulls. When the knot of ships finally cleared the breakwater, the silence broke into cheers that echoed from stone to stone. Ohio did not arrive as a healthy ship. She arrived as a container that could be emptied. She settled onto the harbor bed even as hoses went across. Her keel touched mud and took the strain that her frames no longer could. Pumps pushed fuel first to the airfields at Lucca, Hal Far, and Ta Kali, and to essential services that kept water and power moving. Within hours, Bowsers were rolling, and reserve figures on the island's boards turned from days to weeks. Unloading continued with a salvage rhythm. Pump, settle, clamp a new leak, pump again. Some of the cargo was aviation spirit, some was other fuel. All of it had a job the day it landed. Malta had other arrivals from the Convoy too, and their flour and ammunition mattered, but Ohio's cargo had leverage. With avgas topped up, fighters could protect unloading by day and strike at sea lanes again by night. Once the tanks ran dry, Ohio's role ended. Her hull sagged and parted as predicted. Later she was cut up where she lay. In strict ledger terms, that loss had been in the plan. Save the cargo even if the hull did not survive. In human terms, it meant that crews who had fought fires on a moving deck now watched the deck itself become scrap. What brought her in was not luck alone. It was improvised geometry, ships used as splints to stiffen and steer a wreck until the last mile ran out. Triage, rotation, and carefully rationed power kept that geometry intact under fire. The delivery changed the island's curve in a way small arrivals never could, and it did so in time for the next phase to begin. Fuel began to move as soon as hoses bit. Ration coupons organized the queues for bread, kerosene, and sugar, and the issue stabilized, not lavish, but livable. Deliveries hit schedules again, and the daily notices stopped shrinking the loaf or pushing back collection times by hours. Aviation fuel was the fulcrum. Within days, Spitfires returned to standing patrols over the island and its approaches, and fighter escorts rose to meet inbound raids with height and time to spare. Beaufort, a British torpedo bomber, crews resumed training sorties, then switched to live runs against Axis convoys once stocks of torpedoes, fuel, and spares aligned. Harbor power returned in step. Electric cranes and capstans drew steady current, so unloading rates climbed and repairs accelerated. With fuel in the tanks, power stations ran longer shifts, dock gangs turned ships faster, and the salvage of damaged piers stopped being a stop-start exercise dictated by blackout and brownout. The math tied all this together. A single tanker's cargo translated into thousands of fighter hours and dozens of strike missions, because each patrol and each sortie burned fuel measured in tens or hundreds of gallons, while the island now held millions. The marginal gallon of avgas protected the harbor while it worked and multiplied offensive effect once aircraft ranged out over the central lanes. Targeting sharpened as well. Ultra-British decrypts of Axis communications filtered through Malta's headquarters to submarine captains, bomber crews, and radar posts. Reports flagged which convoys carried fuel, which hugged coasts, and which would cross choke points like the Skirky Channel, the narrow waters between Sicily and Tunisia, at night. Aircraft and boats were sent to those coordinates, not to the empty sea. By early September 1942, interdiction took a steady rhythm. Spitfires guarded Malta and covered the harbor by day. At dusk and dawn, strike aircraft and submarines went hunting where decrypts and reconnaissance overlapped. Attacks fell on convoys bound for Tripoli, Benghazi, and later Tunisian ports, and on tankers in particular. Between September and November, Axis shipping losses in the central Mediterranean mounted into the hundreds of thousands of tons, a scale that starved depots and frontline units alike. Civil life steadied in the space that created. Bakeries fired more reliably and could keep to their allotments. Hospitals lit operating rooms and sterilized equipment without constant curtailments. Trams and lorries moved on timetables rather than by rumor. Coupons still rationed but fuel enabled, so collection points opened and closed on the hour, and distribution lorries reached outlying districts without burning through emergency reserves. The feedback loop tightened in Malta's favor. Interdiction cut Axis fuel to North Africa, which forced the Regia Aeronautica and the Luftwaffe to trim flying hours and scale back some raids. Fewer sorties and thinner bomber formations reduced damage to Malta's docks and airfields, which in turn kept unloading smooth and kept sortie rates up, which then pushed interdiction harder. None of this meant abundance. The island still counted sacks, drums, and flight towers, and planners still wrote priorities in hard lines. Air defense first, strike second, civil power next. But pedestal changed the slope of the curve. It turned a slide toward silence into a period when Malta could speak and be heard in the lanes that mattered. By late November 1942, the pattern met larger events. Allied landings in North Africa, Operation Torch, Allied invasion of North Africa in November 1942, opened new fronts and further stretched Axis logistics. Malta's revived squadrons and rebuilt docks made that pressure immediate at sea, not just on maps. The island had been fed enough to fight, and in fighting made the next convoys, for both sides, harder or easier to live with. The price was counted in hulls and names. 9 of the 14 merchant ships never made it. HMS Eagle lay on the bottom with 2 cruisers, Cairo and Manchester, and the destroyer Foresight. Hundreds of sailors and airmen died. Many more were pulled aboard destroyers or lifted from rafts, burned, shaken, and alive. Escorts were depleted and battered, yet the essentials arrived. HMS Indomitable was out of the fight with a scarred deck. Nigeria and Kenya leaked and slowed but stayed in the line that mattered. The convoy's survivors disgorged flour, ammunition, and, above all, fuel. In the arithmetic that ruled Malta, those deliveries bought weeks, not days, and turned flying schedules from rationed minutes into planned hours. The strategic payoff followed fast. Through September and October 1942, Malta's submarines and strike aircraft harried Axis routes to North Africa, while British forces prepared for the Second Battle of El Alamein. When the battle opened late in October, Rommel's supply line was already strained by losses at sea, thin reserves ashore, and tighter Allied timing. In November, Operation Torch, Allied invasion of North Africa in November 1942, added pressure from the west, and Malta's revived squadrons turned straits and channels into risk zones for any tanker that moved. Commanders read the ledger and marked lessons. The Sicilian narrows demanded denser night screens and destroyer pickets thrown farther out, with overlapping searchlights and star shells to break up fast torpedo attacks before they reached the columns. Fighter direction improved too. Radar plots fed controllers who pushed patrols to the right height and position rather than chasing reports. Routes were still masked for firepower, but staging and timing dispersed convoys in space while keeping them linked by radio, so the enemy could not mass every weapon against one point at one time. This was coalition logistics in action, not a bannered parade. Ohio was an American-built hull, sailed under British command, physically steadied by Royal Navy destroyers. The escorts burned British fuel and fired British shells, but industrial America had built the pumps and engines that mattered on the day. Malta itself mixed resources. Commonwealth pilots flew from British-run airfields while Maltese stevedores worked the quays under sirens. The effect was a single chain from a Pennsylvania shipyard to a Stone Harbor under fire. The Maltese framed the memory in their own calendar. They called it the Santa Maria Convoy, after the Feast of the Assumption on the 15th of August, when the damaged ships arrived. Each year, bells and wreaths mark that date at coastal churches and harbors. Survivors and families built the ritual around gratitude and loss, and the island's story set the convoy in civic time as well as military time. Ohio's image endured beyond steel and smoke. She proved a point about utility over elegance. A ship did not need to look whole to perform a job if the system around her provided what she lacked. Lashed to destroyers, grounded gently in the harbor while pumps ran, she was a container that delivered exactly when a container was what the war required. The Royal Navy's willingness to sacrifice hulls to preserve cargo was not sentiment. It was the cold mathematics of a siege turned to advantage. The exchange rate stayed brutal even on paper. More than half the merchantmen were lost to bring in 5, and one of those broke in harbor after unloading. A fleet paid with a carrier and cruisers to move a few tens of thousands of tons. Yet the returns compounded. Fuel lifted fighter patrols that shielded unloading, which kept docks open, which kept sorties flowing, which cut Axis deliveries, which weakened the front that held against Allied attacks on land. Malta's survival changed the arithmetic of the Mediterranean campaign because it reintroduced an active threat at the center of the map. From that point, the curve bent toward Allied control. Through the winter of 1942 and into 1943, Axis ships faced dwindling cover, longer detours, and growing losses. By May 1943, the Axis evacuated Tunisia, and by July, Allied convoys moved to Sicily under escort and cover that Malta helped stage and supply. The island had been fed enough to fight. With fuel and resolve restored, it shaped the sea war's closing months. As the bells over Grand Harbor faded, hoses thumped and fuel flowed. Bowsers rolled to the airfields and fighters refueled and climbed. Convoys, coupons, and calculus converged to turn a shattered tanker into leverage. The cost was grievous. The effect was disproportionate. From one harbor, the campaign's numbers changed in the air, and at sea, as schedules steadied, docks worked, patrols guarded, and strikes resumed. The arithmetic bent away from silence and toward sustained pressure. The bells that greeted arrival did not close the account. Their echo became the metronome of resumed operations.